The scent of lemon oil and old stone clung to the air, a sterile perfume for a life lived in the margins. Ilara Vance, at 22, saw her reflection not in mirrors but in the polished surfaces of other people's lives. Today, it was the vast, unforgiving expanse of the black marble floor in the main hall. Her image was a watery distortion, a ghost with a cleaning cloth in hand, lost in the cavernous silence of the clifftop estate. She was a curator of a museum where no one ever visited, the sole caretaker of a home that felt more like a tomb. Each swipe of the cloth was a measured, rhythmic motion that marked the passing of another empty day. The cold of the stone seeped through her knees, a familiar chill that seemed to have taken permanent residence in her bones, a constant reminder of the hollow space within her chest. If you want to know what happens when the silence she lives in is finally and irrevocably broken, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. Let's continue. This life of quiet servitude was not a choice, but a cage forged from love and tragedy. Years ago, she had been an art restoration student, her hands destined to breathe life back into forgotten masterpieces. Her world had been one of vibrant color, of texture and history. Then, a single phone call had washed it all away in a monochrome tide of grief. The accident that claimed her parents left her as the sole guardian of her younger sister, whose fragile health was a constant, demanding presence. The dreams of Florence and the scent of linseed oil were packed away, replaced by the practical, suffocating weight of responsibility. She had traded her future for her sister's, a sacrifice made so silently that no one, not even her sister, truly understood its cost. Her innocence was another casualty of this deferred life. Ilara's virginity was not a statement of moral principle or a treasure she was saving, but rather a quiet, unvisited room in the house of her soul. It was the simple, stark consequence of a heart that had never been given the chance to beat for itself. Boys had tried in their fumbling high school ways, but her focus was always elsewhere, on grades, on part-time jobs, on the growing shadows under her mother's eyes. Later, grief became her only partner, a possessive and demanding suitor that left no room for anyone else. She had walled off her own desires so thoroughly that she barely recognized their faint whispers anymore, mistaking the ache of loneliness for simple fatigue. It was a part of her she didn't examine, a symbol of a life yet to begin. The house itself was her constant companion and tormentor. Perched on a cliff overlooking a turbulent sea, the Croft estate was a monument to modern isolation. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and stone, designed by a man who clearly wished to keep the world at a calculated distance. Julian Croft, the billionaire enigma she worked for, had built a home that perfectly mirrored his reputation, formidable, beautiful, and utterly devoid of warmth. For Ilara, its sprawling minimalist rooms were a constant, oppressive reminder of her own smallness. The floor-to-ceiling windows didn't frame the majestic view of the ocean. They exposed her, making her feel like a specimen under glass. The silence within its walls was a physical presence, so profound and heavy it felt like it could crush her. Her existence within this architectural marvel was governed by a set of sterile, typewritten notes. Mr. Croft was a specter, a name on a bank transfer, a set of impossibly high standards she was expected to maintain. He was perpetually overseas, a ghost in his own home, and she was the ghost who tended to his absence. Instructions would appear on the kitchen island, curt, impersonal commands regarding the polishing of silver, the temperature of the wine cellar, the arrangement of books he never read. She had never heard his voice, never seen his face in person. This detachment suited her. It made the work easier, transforming her role into a simple transaction. She was a function, not a person, and in this sterile world, that felt safer than being seen. Yet, there was one place where a sliver of the old Ilara survived, the library. It was the only room in the house that felt lived in, its shelves groaning with leather-bound volumes on art, history, and architecture. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of artists and thinkers, she allowed herself to breathe. In stolen moments, late at night when the weight of the day was too much to bear, she would run her fingers over the embossed spines, pulling down a heavy tome on Renaissance frescoes or Dutch masters. The scent of old paper and leather was a balm to her soul, a painful but precious link to the woman she was supposed to become. It was in these quiet acts of defiance that she kept her own flame from being completely extinguished by the suffocating emptiness of her life. This was the rhythm of her days, a cycle of silent work, quiet worry for her sister, and fleeting moments of escape in a world of books. She was suspended in time, living a life that felt like a placeholder for a real one that might never arrive. The profound emptiness wasn't a sharp, stabbing pain, but a dull, persistent ache in her core. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of a great precipice, knowing she was meant to fly but having forgotten how to use her wings. She moved through the marble halls, a specter of youth and unfulfilled promise, completely unaware that the master of the house, the man who was never supposed to be home, was about to return and shatter her carefully constructed silence forever. The bus ride back to the city was a jarring descent from the sterile silence of the cliffs into the chaotic symphony of urban life. The clean, salt-tinged air of the Croft estate was replaced by the thick, gritty perfume of exhaust fumes and rain-soaked pavement. Alara pressed her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass of the window, watching the neat, manicured lawns of the wealthy suburbs bleed into the crowded, graffiti-tagged brick of her own neighborhood. Each stop brought on more people, their weary faces and loud conversations a stark contrast to the profound emptiness she had grown accustomed to. This weekly journey was a pilgrimage between two prisons, one of gilded isolation and one of loving, desperate necessity. She felt like a traveler between worlds, belonging fully to neither, her true self lost somewhere in the space between the clifftop mansion and the third-floor walk-up she called home. Her apartment, shared with her sister Lila, was the physical opposite of the Croft estate. Where the mansion was a study in expansive minimalism, their small flat was a cluttered, cozy haven of necessity. Books were stacked in corners, a testament to Lila's insatiable mind, and colorful, hand-knitted blankets were draped over the worn-out sofa. The air smelled of Lila's herbal tea and the faint, medicinal scent of her nebulizer. Lara's room was barely a room at all, just a space partitioned off from the living area by a heavy curtain, affording her a sliver of privacy. While she craved the quiet order of her workplace, this cramped space was filled with a life and warmth the mansion could never possess. It was the heart of her sacrifice, the reason for every polished floor and scrubbed surface, a constant, breathing reminder of what was at stake. The weight of that sacrifice was most palpable on Friday evenings, when she sat at their small kitchen table to sort through the week's mail. The crisp, impersonal envelopes from the estate's payroll service lay beside the pastel-colored, threatening ones from medical billing companies. It was a cruel juxtaposition of wealth and want. One check, so easily signed by a man she'd never met, was all that stood between Lila and a health crisis. The numbers on the invoices blurred together, a relentless tide of debt that threatened to pull them under. This was the true nature of her gilded cage. The high salary wasn't a luxury but a lifeline. It bought medicine, specialist appointments, and the fragile peace of mind that came with knowing she could handle the next emergency. It was a transaction where she traded her freedom for her sister's future. Her life was a carefully constructed routine, built to maximize income and minimize risk. 3 days a week, she took classes at the local community college. Not the prestigious art academy of her dreams, but a practical path toward a stable degree. The other 4 days were spent at the estate, lost in the silent, demanding world of Julian Croft. Her classmates saw a quiet, diligent student, unaware that her evenings were spent polishing silver in a house the size of a museum. Her neighbors saw a dutiful sister, oblivious to the fact that her employer was one of the most powerful and reclusive men in the country. She existed in these parallel lives, carefully keeping them from intersecting, terrified that one world might shatter the other. This duality was exhausting, a constant performance that left her feeling hollow and unseen, a ghost in her own life story. The pressure was not just financial, it was familial, embodied by her Aunt Carol, her mother's older sister and the family's self-appointed matriarch. Carol would visit on Sundays, her presence filling their small apartment with the scent of expensive perfume and unsolicited advice. She would survey the cramped space with a look of thinly veiled pity, her gaze lingering on the worn furniture and the pile of medical supplies on the counter. Her questions were always the same, sharp little needles cloaked in concern. "Are you eating enough, dear? You look so pale. And this job, is it really suitable for a young woman of your background? A live-in maid, Ilara. What will people think?" Each word was a judgment, a reminder of how far she had fallen from the family's expectations of a respectable life. For Aunt Carol, a respectable life meant one thing: a good marriage. She saw Lara's single status not as a consequence of circumstance, but as a personal failing. "You're 22, Ilara. You're not getting any younger," she would say, stirring her tea with a clink of disapproval. "You can't take care of your sister forever on a housekeeper's salary. You need a man, a provider. Have you met anyone? There must be eligible men in that part of town." The suggestion was always there, hanging in the air, that Ilara should leverage her youth and quiet beauty to secure a future, to find a stable, boring man who could lift the burden she carried. This constant pressure to conform, to see her life solution in a husband, made her feel like a commodity being prepared for market, her own desires and dreams irrelevant to the transaction. Ilara would just nod and smile, a placid mask hiding the storm of resentment and frustration within. She couldn't explain to her aunt that the very idea of dating felt like a betrayal of her responsibilities, a selfish indulgence she couldn't afford. How could she bring a man into this life of constant worry and financial strain? How could she explain the profound exhaustion that settled deep in her bones at the end of each week? The men her aunt deemed suitable, predictable, safe, and utterly uninspiring held no appeal for her. The thought of settling for a life of quiet domesticity, a different kind of cage, was suffocating. Her aunt's words only amplified her sense of isolation, reinforcing the belief that no one truly saw her, only the role she was expected to play: the dutiful daughter, the self-sacrificing sister, the future wife. The oppression was a quiet, creeping thing, woven into the fabric of her days. It was in the condescending tone of the pharmacist when she picked up Lila's expensive medication. It was in the pitying glances from old family friends who remembered her as the artistic one and now saw her as a cautionary tale. It was in the very architecture of the city, which seemed designed to keep the wealthy on their hills and the working class in their crowded valleys. She was trapped by a web of circumstances: Lila's health, the mountain of debt, her aunt's suffocating expectations, and her own profound sense of duty. Every choice felt predetermined, every path leading back to the same conclusion: her life was not her own. It belonged to her sister, to her family's memory, to the crushing weight of obligation. On the nights before she returned to the estate, she would often pull a small, worn wooden box from under her bed. Inside, nestled in soft velvet, were the tools of her former life: fine-tipped brushes, palette knives, and small pots of dried pigment. She would run her fingers over the smooth, cool metal of the knives, remembering the feel of mixing colors, the singular focus of restoring a piece of forgotten beauty. It was a painful ritual, a visit to the ghost of the woman she was meant to be. This box was her most private secret, a tangible link to a dream that felt more distant with each passing day. It was a reminder that before she was a caretaker and a housekeeper, she was an artist, a creator. The contrast was a silent scream in her soul, a quiet agony of unfulfilled potential. As she packed her simple duffel bag for her week at the Croft estate, a sense of resignation would wash over her. She was returning to the silence, to the cold marble and the endless, sterile rooms. The mansion was a prison, but it was also a sanctuary from the judgments and demands of the outside world. There she was invisible, a functionary, and in that invisibility there was a strange kind of freedom. She could move through the beautiful empty spaces and pretend, just for a moment, that the beauty was hers. She was trading one form of confinement for another, caught in a cycle of sacrifice and servitude. She straightened her shoulders, zipped the bag, and prepared to re-enter the gilded cage, completely unaware that its reclusive master was about to return and see her for the very first time. The change came not as a gradual shift, but as a violent rupture in the fabric of her reality. It began with the storm. The sky, a placid blue just hours before, had curdled into a bruised and turbulent gray, pressing down on the glass house with an almost physical weight. The sea churned below, its roar a constant, angry companion to the wind that shrieked around the stone corners of the estate. It was on this afternoon that the plumbing in the small staff quarters, a chronically neglected part of the mansion, finally surrendered. A burst pipe sent a flood of rusty water across the floor, rendering her modest bathroom unusable. The isolation, the oppressive silence, And now this final inconvenience conspired to push Elara toward a decision she would never have otherwise dared to make. A small act of rebellion born from sheer desperation. She found herself standing at the threshold of the master suite, a wing of the house she was permitted to clean but never to inhabit. The air inside was different, still and cool, carrying the faint, masculine scent of sandalwood and cedar. It was Julian Croft's scent, an olfactory ghost in his own sanctuary. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of the storm. For a moment she hesitated, the ingrained rules of her employment screaming at her to turn back. But the thought of the cold, murky water in her own quarters, and the deep, soul-aching chill that had settled into her bones, propelled her forward. She slipped inside, closing the heavy oak door behind her, the soft click of the latch sounding as final and damning as the closing of a cell door. The master bathroom was a cathedral of white marble and gleaming chrome, a space larger than her entire apartment. A monolithic tub, carved from a single block of stone, sat before a wall of glass that offered a terrifyingly beautiful view of the raging storm. It felt like a sacrilege, a profound violation. But the desire for a simple human comfort, the feeling of warmth, overpowered her fear. She turned the heavy silver taps, and the rush of steaming water was a sound of pure indulgence. Stripping off her simple work uniform, she submerged herself in the deep, fragrant water, a sigh of relief escaping her lips. For a few precious stolen minutes, she was not Elara the housekeeper, but simply a woman, anonymous and free, enveloped in a warmth that seemed to seep right through her skin and into her very soul. The sound that shattered her brief sanctuary was sharp and guttural, a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway below, followed by the authoritative slam of a car door. Panic, cold and immediate, seized her. It couldn't be. Mr. Croft's itinerary, a document she studied with religious fervor, had him in Tokyo for another 3 days. Her mind raced through a list of impossibilities. A security guard, a delivery, anyone but him. She scrambled out of the tub, water sluicing from her body, onto the pristine marble floor, her hands fumbling for the nearest covering. She grabbed a thick, impossibly soft towel from a heated rack, his towel, and wrapped it tightly around her trembling form, her wet hair clinging to her neck and shoulders as the sound of a key in the main door echoed up from the hall. He entered the suite not like a man returning home, but like a force of nature invading a quiet space. Julian Croft was taller than she had imagined from the few blurry photographs she had seen online, his presence so immense it seemed to suck all the air from the room. He was drenched from the storm, his black overcoat dripping onto the pale wood floors, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His face, which might have been handsome under other circumstances, was a mask of cold fury and bone-deep weariness. He didn't seem to be looking for anything or anyone. He moved with the singular purpose of a man seeking refuge in the one place in the world he considered his own, a fortress built to keep his demons at bay. And then he saw her. He stopped dead in the doorway of his bathroom, his body going rigid. For a long, silent moment, the only sounds were the howling wind outside and the frantic, terrified beat of Elara's own heart. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea themselves, raked over her. The bare, wet shoulders, the dark towel that was so clearly his, the puddle of water at her feet staining his perfect floor. She saw the initial shock in his expression curdle into something far more dangerous. A glacial, controlled rage. It was the anger of a man whose meticulously ordered world had been violated, whose sacred solitude had been breached by the one person who was supposed to be invisible. He looked at her as if she were an infestation, a stain on his sterile existence. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, a wave of shame so profound it was physically painful. She opened her mouth to speak, to stammer out an apology, an explanation about the burst pipe, anything to quell the storm gathering in his eyes. But the words wouldn't come. All she could think of was the loss of her job, the looming medical bills for Lila, the utter ruin this single, selfish act of comfort had wrought. He hadn't said a word, yet she felt utterly condemned by his silence. His stillness was more terrifying than any shout, a potent and powerful indictment of her transgression. She clutched the towel tighter, a flimsy shield against the sheer force of his presence, feeling herself shrink under his cold, dissecting gaze. He was the master of this universe, and she had just committed the ultimate sin. Before the crushing weight of his fury could erupt, before he could utter the words that would surely end her life as she knew it, something inside her broke. It was the exhaustion, the loneliness, the constant, gnawing ache of a life lived in the shadows. In that moment, looking at this formidable, powerful man, she saw not just an employer she had wronged, but another soul trapped in the same vast, empty house. She saw the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes, the profound isolation that radiated from him like a palpable chill. And so, when she finally spoke, her voice was not pleading or fearful, but a soft, trembling whisper that carried the weight of her entire existence. A confession that had nothing and everything to do with a broken pipe. "I'm sorry," she breathed, the words barely audible over the storm. She met his icy gaze, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and she spoke the truth that had been hiding in the hollows of her heart. "The silence in this house gets so loud sometimes. I just wanted to feel warm." The words hung in the air between them, simple, raw, and utterly disarming. They bypassed the anger, the rules, the chasm of their social standing, and struck a chord deep within him, a note of shared loneliness he had long since buried under layers of wealth and power. It was a language he understood better than any business proposal or financial report, the dialect of a soul adrift in a self-made prison. His expression flickered. The glacial rage did not melt, but it fractured, tiny cracks appearing in the impenetrable facade. For the first time, he truly saw her. He saw not the maid, the employee, the functionary, but a young woman shivering in his towel, her eyes holding a reflection of his own desolate solitude. A strange, unsettling current passed between them, an unwilling recognition that defied logic and protocol. He didn't fire her. He didn't speak. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he simply gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, turned on his heel, and walked out of the suite, leaving her alone with the storm inside and out. The silence that descended in his wake was different now, no longer empty, but charged with a terrifying new possibility. The days that followed were a study in tension, a silent opera performed in the vast, echoing halls of the estate. Julian Croft was no longer a ghost. He was a solid, breathing presence that reshaped the very atmosphere of the house. The air itself seemed to crackle with his proximity. Elara found herself moving with a new, heightened awareness, every nerve ending alive to the sound of his footsteps on the floor above. The low murmur of his voice on a phone call, the distant click of his office door. She cleaned with a frantic, focused energy, her hands trembling slightly as she polished surfaces that might soon feel the brush of his fingers. The silence was no longer empty. It was a canvas, stretched taut and waiting for the first, irrevocable stroke of contact, a quiet prelude to a storm far greater than the one that had brought him home. Their first encounter after that night was agonizingly mundane, yet fraught with 1,000 unspoken words. He found her in the kitchen early the next morning as she was carefully measuring coffee grounds. He didn't speak at first, simply leaning against the steel island, his arms crossed over his chest. He was dressed in a simple gray sweater and dark trousers, looking less like a billionaire and more like a man lost in his own home. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. "There is coffee," he stated, not as a command, but as a simple, awkward fact. She could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. His eyes, the color of a winter sea, held hers for a beat too long, and in their depths, she saw not anger, but a flicker of something she couldn't name. A weary curiosity that made her feel more exposed than she had been in his towel. The library became their unspoken sanctuary, a neutral territory where the rigid lines of their roles could blur. He found her there a few nights later, long after her duties were done. She wasn't cleaning. She was sitting on the floor, a heavy volume of Caravaggio's work open on her lap, her face illuminated by a single reading lamp. She looked up, startled, as he entered, ready to stammer an apology, but he waved it away with an impatient gesture. "Chiaroscuro," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. The violent contrast of light and shadow. He walked over and looked down at the page, his shadow falling over hers. For the first time, he was not seeing the maid. He was seeing the art student, the woman with a hunger for beauty, and the shared appreciation for the artist's tormented genius created a fragile, unexpected bridge between them. That night, they talked for over an hour, their voices low in the cathedral of books. He asked about her studies, and for the first time in years, Bellaris spoke of her passion, the words tumbling out of her with a desperate, forgotten energy. She described the delicate process of restoring a painting, of coaxing life back from the brink of decay. He listened with an unnerving intensity, his gaze never leaving her face. He, in turn, spoke of the architecture of the house, of his desire to create a space where form followed not function, but emotion, or the lack thereof. He was revealing a piece of his soul through the language of art and design, a language she understood intimately. This intellectual spark was more dangerous than any physical touch, a meeting of minds that felt illicit and profoundly intimate. The sterile routine of the house began to fray at the edges. Instructions were no longer left on cold, typewritten notes. Instead, he would find her, delivering his requests in person with a clipped, formal tone that failed to mask the underlying search for contact. He began taking his meals not in the formal dining room, but on a stool at the kitchen island while she prepared her own simple dinner. He never ate with her, but he would stay, nursing a glass of whiskey, the silence between them punctuated by the simple sounds of her cooking. She could feel his eyes on her as she moved, a silent observation that was both unnerving and deeply validating. He was watching her live, and in his gaze, she began to feel the faint, terrifying stirrings of her own dormant self come back to life. This new proximity ignited a war within Alara. A part of her, the pragmatic, responsible part that had guided her for so long, screamed in protest. This was her employer, a man whose world could crush hers without a second thought. To indulge this burgeoning connection was a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed. Her thoughts would drift to Lila, to the mountain of medical bills, to the fragile stability this very job provided. Julian Croft represented a catastrophic risk, a beautiful, intoxicating poison that threatened the foundations of her carefully constructed life. The desire that bloomed in her chest felt like a sickness, a selfish indulgence she had no right to entertain. The guilt was a constant, bitter taste at the back of her throat, a reminder of the high price of a single moment of weakness. A phone call from her Aunt Carol threw the conflict into sharper relief. The familiar litany of concerns and veiled criticisms felt more grating than ever. "Have you met anyone, dear? A nice, stable young man? You can't spend your youth cleaning up after some rich recluse." Alara listened, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The nice, stable young man her aunt envisioned, a man with a modest job, a simple life, a safe future, seemed like a ghost from another dimension. How could she explain that her heart was being held captive by a man who was the complete antithesis of safety? A man as turbulent and unpredictable as the sea crashing against the cliffs below his home. The chasm between her family's expectations and the dangerous reality of her feelings made her feel profoundly, terrifyingly alone. Julian, seemingly oblivious to her internal turmoil, continued his subtle, persistent courtship. It was a campaign waged not with words or gifts of flowers, but with gestures that spoke directly to the woman he was beginning to uncover. He started leaving things for her on the kitchen island. An art journal with an article on a new restoration technique, a rare first edition of a poetry collection they had discussed, a small, perfect seashell he must have found on a solitary walk along the beach. These were not the gifts of an employer to an employee. They were offerings, quiet acknowledgments of her inner life. Each small object was a question, a test of the fragile connection between them, and with every beat of her heart, she knew she was failing to maintain her distance. The inevitable finally happened in the hushed quiet of the library. They were both reaching for the same volume on architectural history, his large, warm hand covering hers on the cool leather spine. The contact was electric, a sudden, sharp jolt that seemed to arc through her entire body, lighting up nerve endings she didn't know she possessed. They both recoiled as if burned, a silent gasp hanging in the air between them. His eyes darkened, a storm of emotion swirling in their depths, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. The raw, undisguised desire in his gaze mirrored the frantic pulse hammering at the base of her throat. The moment passed, broken by the distant chime of a clock, but the charge remained, a dangerous, unspoken promise that had now been given form. From that moment on, Elara found her carefully constructed walls crumbling. She began to catalog the details of him with an artist's precision. She learned the sound of his different moods from the weight of his footfalls. She noticed the way a single muscle in his jaw would clench when he was fighting for control during a difficult business call. She memorized the scent of sandalwood and clean rain that clung to his sweaters. He was no longer just Julian Croft, the billionaire enigma. He was Julian, a man of quiet habits and deep hidden sorrows. This transformation from a concept into a man was her undoing. The desire she felt was no longer a vague, abstract pull. It was a sharp, specific ache that centered entirely on him, a craving for his presence that was becoming unbearable. He, in turn, began to dismantle the last vestiges of their professional boundary. One afternoon, he unrolled architectural plans on the massive dining room table and asked for her opinion on the design of a new art gallery he was funding. He didn't want the opinion of a housekeeper. He wanted the eye of Elara Vance, the art restorer. As she spoke, pointing out flaws in the lighting and suggesting changes to the flow of the space, she felt a heady rush of power and purpose. He listened intently, nodding, his respect for her knowledge a potent aphrodisiac. In that moment they were not master and servant, but collaborators, equals in a shared passion. This dangerous illusion of parity made her forget, just for a moment, the precariousness of her position. The moral crisis reached its peak. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was standing on the edge of a precipice. To give in to this tidal wave of emotion would mean losing herself, losing the control she had fought so hard to maintain over her life. It would mean risking not just her job, but her sister's very well-being. The sensible choice was to leave, to pack her bags, walk away from the gilded cage, and never look back. She could find another job, a less compromising position where the lines were clearly drawn and her heart was safe. She tried to picture that life, a life of safety, of predictability, of quiet duty, but the image was a flat, gray canvas, devoid of the terrifying, vibrant color that Julian had brought into her world. Her attempts to retreat, to become invisible again, were futile. Whenever she tried to be more formal, more distant, he would only press closer. He would find her in the garden, his presence a silent question as she tended the roses. He would appear in the kitchen with a cup of tea, his expression guarded but his eyes full of a desperate, unwilling need. She could see the war he was fighting with himself, the ghosts of his past pulling him back, while the present reality of her pushed him forward. He was a man drowning in his own solitude, and he had found in her a fragile, terrifying lifeline. His own vulnerability was a mirror to hers, and it made the thought of leaving feel like an act of profound cruelty to them both. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the main hall. The moonlight streamed through the vast glass walls, bathing the marble floors in an ethereal, silvery light. She found him there, standing before the window, a lone silhouette against the churning, moonlit sea. He was so still he might have been carved from the same stone as the house. On his face, unguarded in the darkness, was a look of such profound, bottomless grief that it stole the breath from her lungs. This was the man behind the power, the wealth, the cold fury. A man shattered by a past he couldn't escape. Her desire, which had been a thing of thrilling, selfish want, was suddenly transformed, deepened by an overwhelming wave of empathy. She didn't just want him, she wanted to heal him. Her dilemma crystallized into a single, terrifying choice. She could choose safety, a life lived within the lines, for her sister, for her aunt, for the memory of the sensible girl she used to be. It was the path of duty, the path of sacrifice. Or she could choose this terrifying, uncertain, and possibly ruinous connection. It was a path that led into the heart of a storm, with no promise of a safe harbor. It was a choice between the woman she was supposed to be and the woman she was becoming in his presence. The fear was immense, a cold hand gripping her heart, but for the first time in her life, the possibility of living, truly living, outweighed the fear of the fall. The decision was taken out of her hands by the heavens. Another storm rolled in from the sea, more ferocious than the first, battering the house with gale-force winds and torrential rain. A crack of thunder, so loud it shook the foundations of the estate, was followed by an abrupt, plunging darkness as the power failed. The emergency generators sputtered and died. They were trapped, surrounded by a primal darkness broken only by the violent, strobe-like flashes of lightning. In that instant, all the roles, all the rules, all the carefully constructed pretenses were stripped away. They were no longer employer and employee. They were simply a man and a woman, alone together against the fury of the night, the storm outside a perfect reflection of the tempest raging between them. She stood frozen in the cavernous living room, her heart pounding in the sudden oppressive silence. A flash of lightning illuminated him across the room, his face a stark mask of shadow and light. He began to walk toward her, his steps slow and deliberate, each one a drumbeat marking the end of her resistance. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, his scent, sandalwood and storm, enveloping her. He didn't touch her, but his nearness was a physical force, pinning her in place. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, rough murmur that was nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "Are you afraid of the storm, Ilara?" he asked, his gaze burning into hers in the dark. "Or are you afraid of me?" Her answer was not a word, but a movement. In the echoing darkness, she took a single, deliberate step toward him. It was a terrifying, monumental journey of a few inches, a crossing of a line that had been etched in stone between their two worlds. It was an act of pure, unadulterated rebellion against her aunt's advice, against her own ingrained sense of duty, against the sensible, frightened girl who had lived inside her for 22 years. She was choosing the storm. She was choosing him. Her fear was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in her stomach, but for the first time her desire was stronger. In that one small step, she was not the maid, the caretaker, or the orphan. She was simply Ilara, a woman claiming a moment of life for herself, consequences be damned. The air grew thin, charged with the gravity of her decision. His reaction was a sharp, ragged intake of breath. A flash of lightning bleached the room white, and in that fleeting, stark illumination, she saw the war on his face. Shock, disbelief, and a profound, aching relief battled with a darkness so intense it was frightening, a raw, possessive hunger that made her tremble. He had expected her to retreat, to apologize, to scurry back into the shadows where she belonged. He had not expected this quiet, defiant surrender. Her courage seemed to unmake him, shattering the icy control that was his armor. He closed the remaining distance between them, his movement no longer slow or deliberate, but urgent, the movement of a man who had been starving for a lifetime, and had just been offered a feast. He was the storm, and she had just walked willingly into its eye. He stopped an inch from her, his large frame a wall of heat and shadow in the oppressive dark. He lifted his hands, and she flinched, a lifetime of timidity rising in her throat. But he didn't touch her. His fingers hovered in the air beside her face, trembling with a restraint that was more potent than any command. She could feel the struggle within him, the battle between the man who kept the world at bay and the man who desperately wanted to pull her into his arms. The scent of him, clean rain, expensive wool, and that intrinsic masculine scent of sandalwood, was intoxicating, clouding her thoughts. In this charged space between them, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of two hearts, beating in a frantic, terrified unison, both on the verge of a spectacular collapse. Then, his fingers finally made contact. The touch was impossibly gentle, a whisper of warmth against the cool skin of her jaw. His calloused thumb brushed slowly, reverently, over her cheekbone, a gesture of such profound tenderness it felt like a brand. For Ilara, a woman whose skin had known only the accidental brush of a stranger in a crowd or the chaste hugs of her sister, the sensation was a cataclysm. A shudder racked her body, a soundless gasp catching in her throat as every nerve ending ignited in a blaze of feeling. It was not just a touch, it was a validation, an acknowledgement of her existence as a woman, as a tangible being of flesh and blood. In that single electrifying moment, He was awakening a part of her soul that had slept since birth, and she knew, with terrifying certainty, that she was lost. He lowered his head, and the kiss was a drowning. It was not the gentle exploratory kiss of novels, but a desperate, frantic collision of need and despair. It was the taste of the storm, of rain and salt and a loneliness so profound it stole her breath. His lips were firm, demanding, yet there was a tremor in them that betrayed his own unraveling. She felt his hand slide from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her damp hair, holding her to him as if he feared she might dissolve into mist. She gave a small, broken sound of surrender, her hands coming up to grip the front of his sweater, clinging to him as the world tilted on its axis. This was not a choice anymore. It was an inevitability, a force of nature as powerful and as merciless as the tempest raging outside the glass walls. The kiss deepened, becoming a language all its own, a raw and desperate conversation that bypassed words entirely. He broke away only to lift her into his arms, the movement fluid and powerful, as if she weighed nothing at all. Her act of transgression was now absolute. She was being carried across the threshold of his private world, away from the cold, semi-public spaces of the estate, and into the one place that was unequivocally his. He moved through the darkness with a predator's certainty, turning down a corridor she had only ever seen from a distance, pushing open a heavy door that led into his bedroom. The air inside was thick with his scent, a sanctuary of shadow and silence. He laid her down on the vast, cool sheets of his bed, the sound of the raging wind and her own frantic heartbeat, the only orchestra for this forbidden opera. In the darkness, broken by the periodic, ghostly flashes of lightning, he loomed over her, he pulled away from her lips, his breathing harsh and uneven. His forehead came to rest against hers, and she could feel the heat and the tension rolling off him in waves. This close, she could see the profound pain etched onto his features, the haunted look in his eyes that the shadows could not hide. "I will ruin you," he rasped, his voice a broken thing, thick with a self-loathing that was terrifying to behold. "Everything I touch, I destroy." It was not a threat, but a confession, a plea for her to save herself from him. In that moment, the powerful billionaire vanished, leaving only Julian, a man so deeply wounded, so convinced of his own toxicity, that he believed love was a weapon in his hands. Her fear was a cold, sharp thing, but her empathy, the core of her very being, was stronger. This was the man beneath the armor, the broken soul hiding in the gilded cage. This was the source of the house's oppressive silence. He was not a monster. He was a man in mourning, not just for the woman he had lost, but for the man he used to be. Instead of pulling away, she lifted a trembling hand, her fingers finding the frantic pulse at the base of his throat, before moving to rest flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She said nothing. She simply met his tormented gaze in the dark and held it, her touch a silent vow. "Rise and engage. I see you. I am not afraid. Let me share the weight." It was an act of profound, unconditional acceptance, a balm offered to a wound he thought was fatal. His control finally, irrevocably, shattered. With a sound that was half groan, half prayer, he captured her mouth again, and this time there was no desperation, only a deep, soul-shaking reverence. As he undressed her, each movement was deliberate, almost worshipful, as if he were unwrapping a priceless, fragile artifact. The lightning outside flashed, illuminating their bodies in stark, beautiful chiaroscuro, turning them into a living sculpture of shadow and light. For Ilara, the loss of her physical virginity was a quiet, profound explosion, not of pain, but of sensation, of being utterly and completely inhabited. It was the shattering of the last wall around her heart, a total and complete surrender. For Julian, it was a fragile, terrifying act of redemption, a moment where he allowed himself to touch something pure without believing he would instantly taint it. As the storm outside began to exhaust its fury, its rumbles softening to a distant murmur, they lay tangled in the sheets. The darkness was no longer threatening. It was a soft, intimate blanket. The silence that settled in the room was not the cold, empty silence of the mansion, but a new, resonant quiet, humming with the aftershock of their collision. Ilara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart, a sound she felt she had been waiting her entire life to hear. A profound sense of peace settled over her, but it was edged with a terrifying vulnerability. She had given him everything: her body, her innocence, the carefully guarded keys to her heart. She had broken every rule, stepped over every line, and in the quiet aftermath of the storm, she had no idea if she had just found her salvation or sealed her own destruction. The dawn that broke through the vast glass walls was not gentle. It was a cold, clinical light, the color of steel and regret, that crept across the floor and fell upon the bed. Alara awoke to it alone. The space beside her was a hollow of cool, empty sheets, the phantom warmth of his body already surrendered to the morning air. The scent of him, sandalwood, and the fading memory of the storm clung to the pillows, a cruel and intoxicating ghost. A deep, unfamiliar ache resonated through her, a physical testament to the night's cataclysmic surrender. She lay perfectly still in the graveyard of tangled sheets, the silence of the house pressing down on her with a new and terrifying weight. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the deafening silence of an unspoken verdict, and she was the one on trial for a crime she had willingly committed. She forced herself to move, her limbs heavy with a mixture of exhaustion and dread. Slipping out of his bed felt like another transgression, a theft of a moment that was already over. She found her simple work clothes folded neatly on a chair where she had left them, a stark and humiliating reminder of her place in this world. The master's suite, which had been a sanctuary of shared intimacy in the darkness, was now once again his territory, a space she had violated. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. Every sound, the rustle of fabric, the soft pad of her bare feet on the floor, seeming to echo with the sound of her shame. There was no sign of him. He had vanished like a phantom, leaving her alone to confront the stark, unforgiving reality of what she had done in the cold light of day. The first blow landed later that morning. She was in the kitchen, her movements stiff and automatic as she prepared a tray of coffee. When he finally appeared, he was already dressed in a severe, dark suit, his face an impenetrable mask of cold control. The wounded, vulnerable man from the storm had been locked away, replaced by the formidable billionaire she had always feared. He didn't look at her. His eyes, which had held such raw, desperate emotion just hours before, were now fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "Leave the tray on the console in the hall," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of any warmth. "I have calls to make. Do not disturb me." The words were like stones, each one a carefully chosen weapon to rebuild the wall between them, to remind her that the night had been an aberration, a mistake he was already erasing. His calculated distance sent a wave of icy panic through her. A frantic, desperate monologue began to scream in her mind. "What have you done?" The question repeated itself, a merciless rhythm against the beat of her own heart. She had risked everything: her job, her sister's fragile security, the last vestiges of her own self-respect, for a connection with a man who could discard her with a single, cold command. The guilt was a physical sickness, churning in her stomach. She thought of Lila, of the next pharmacy bill, of her aunt's disapproving face. She had been so foolish, so recklessly selfish, mistaking a moment of sheer desperation for something more. She had offered him the most vulnerable part of herself, and he had taken it, only to return it to her in the morning, devalued and wrapped in the cold cellophane of his indifference. Throughout the day, she caught glimpses of his self-inflicted torment. She saw him from the hallway pacing his glass-walled office like a caged animal, a phone pressed to his ear, his free hand raking through his hair with a frustrated violence. Later she found a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a single glass on the library table, a silent testament to a lonely, agonizing vigil. He was punishing himself, she realized, retreating into the familiar fortress of his own guilt. The memory of his dead fiancée, a ghost she had momentarily exorcised with her warmth, had clearly returned with the dawn, more powerful than ever. He was pushing her away not out of simple cruelty, but because he truly believed he was poison, and he was trying to save her from the contamination of his own broken soul. This knowledge was no comfort. It only deepened the tragedy. The final, devastating rejection came not as a spoken word, but in the form he had always used to command her, a sterile, typewritten note left on the kitchen island. It was placed exactly where his instructions always were, a deliberate and cruel return to their old dynamic. Her name was not on it. It was a simple, impersonal memo. Asterisk, an emergency has arisen that requires my immediate attention in Zurich. I will be gone for an indefinite period. A significant bonus has been wired to your account for your excellent service. Take the next 2 weeks off. The estate will be closed. The words were a clinical dismissal, a transaction. The bonus was not a gift. It was a severance, a payment for services rendered, reducing the most profound night of her life to a line item in his budget. It was his way of saying it meant nothing. That note was the catalyst. It shattered the last, desperate fragment of hope she had been clinging to. As she stood in the silent kitchen, the crisp paper trembling in her hand, she knew she could not stay. She could not spend 2 weeks wandering these marble halls, haunted by the ghost of their night together, waiting for a man who had already fled. To remain here would be to accept his verdict, to agree that she was nothing more than a temporary diversion, an employee who had overstepped her bounds. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary of a kind, now felt like a tomb, and the thought of staying within its walls was suffocating. The pain of his rejection was a sharp physical agony, but beneath it, a new, unfamiliar feeling began to stir, a cold, hard ember of indignation. As she began to pack her few belongings into her worn duffel bag, a profound shift occurred within her. The shame and guilt that had consumed her began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. This was not her failure. His inability to accept the connection they had shared, his retreat into the prison of his past, was his tragedy, not hers. She had been brave. She had been honest. She had offered a piece of her soul to a man who was too broken to hold it. And now, she would take it back. The act of folding her simple clothes, of placing her worn books into the bag, became a ritual of reclamation. She was not the frightened girl who had arrived here months ago. She had walked through a storm, both literal and emotional, and she had survived. She was leaving not as a victim, but as a woman making a choice for her own dignity. She walked through the silent, cavernous rooms for the last time. The afternoon sun cast long, lonely shadows across the polished floors. The house seemed to hold its breath, a monument to the beautiful, tragic thing that had briefly lived within its walls. She did not look for any sign of him, knowing he was already gone, both physically and emotionally. On the cold steel of the kitchen island, where she had found his dismissive note, she placed her keys. The small metallic sound echoed in the vast silence. A final, definitive period at the end of a chapter. She did not look back. She walked out the massive front door, the cool sea air on her face feeling like a baptism, a cleansing of the past 24 hours. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, sealing away the man and the memory. On the bus ride back to the city, she watched the clifftop estate recede until it was just a sharp, geometric shape against the turbulent sky. The ache in her chest was a vast, hollow space, a wound that she knew would take a long time to heal. She had lost her job, the fragile security it provided, and the first man she had ever allowed into her heart. The future was a terrifying, uncertain void. But as the bus carried her further away from the silence of the marble halls and back toward the chaotic, demanding reality of her own life, she felt something else alongside the pain. It was a fragile, unfamiliar sensation, like the first tentative beat of a wing. It was the feeling of freedom. She had lost the gilded cage, but in doing so she had finally, irrevocably, found herself. 6 months passed, each one a careful brushstroke in the restoration of her own life. Ilara used the money from Julian, what he had intended as a severance, as a foundation. It was not a monument to him, but a launching pad for herself. It secured Lila's medical care for the year, lifting a crushing weight from her shoulders, and it paid for her first semester back at the art academy, the real one from her dreams. She found a part-time job in a small, dusty restoration studio downtown, where the scent of linseed oil and turpentine became her new perfume. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's life. The hollow ache in her chest had been filled, not with another person, but with the vibrant, demanding colors of her own rediscovered purpose. The memory of the clifftop estate was a scar, but it was a scar that had taught her the geography of her own strength. The invitation arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, a thick cream-colored card with the stark, familiar Croft insignia embossed in silver. The Croft Gallery of Modern Art was opening with the benefactor's gala, and her restoration professor, having secured a handful of student passes, had given one to her. Her first instinct was to burn it. The name was a key to a room in her heart she had sealed shut. But as she held the heavy card, tracing the sharp lines of the logo, a different feeling took root. It was not fear, but a quiet, defiant curiosity. She wanted to see the space they had discussed, the building whose soul she had briefly touched. She would go not for him, or in spite of him, but for herself. It was a final visit to a ghost, a way to prove that the silence of marble halls no longer had any power over her. The gallery was a symphony of light and space. It possessed the same clean, minimalist lines as his house, the same vast walls of glass, but it was fundamentally different. It was alive. Laughter and conversation echoed where there had once been only oppressive silence. The walls, once bare and sterile, were now adorned with vibrant, challenging works of art. Ilara, dressed in a simple, deep blue dress she had bought with her first paycheck from the studio, moved through the crowd. She felt an uncanny sense of belonging, not as a guest, but as a silent contributor. She saw the way the light from the skylights fell on a particular sculpture, a specific suggestion she had made, and a small, bittersweet smile touched her lips. He had listened. Even in his absence, in his rejection, he had been listening. It was a silent, anonymous acknowledgement that resonated deeper than any apology. She saw him across the main atrium, a solitary figure in a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. He was speaking to a senator, but his eyes were distant, his posture radiating a familiar, profound loneliness. He looked thinner, the sharp planes of his face more pronounced, and the restless energy that had always hummed beneath his surface seemed to have been replaced by a deep, settled weariness. Her heart gave a single painful throb, an echo of the girl who had loved him, but the feeling that followed was not longing, but a quiet, piercing clarity. She no longer saw a powerful billionaire or a tragic romantic figure. She saw a man still trapped in his own beautiful, self-made cage. He was a masterpiece in need of restoration, but she knew now, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was not the artist meant for that particular job. As if he could feel the weight of her gaze across the crowded space, his head turned. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, swept the room with a practiced indifference until they found hers. The world around them seemed to mute, the cacophony of the gala fading into a distant hum. For a single suspended moment, there was only the silent, charged space between them. She saw a universe of emotions flash in his eyes: shock, a raw and unguarded regret, and a flicker of desperate, pleading hope that was so intense it was almost painful to witness. He took a half-step forward, an involuntary motion, a magnetic pull he was powerless to resist. But Ilara did not move. She did not look away. She stood her ground, her gaze steady, her heart beating a calm, even rhythm. She was no longer the girl who shivered in his bathroom. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of immense complexity. Not forgiveness, not an invitation, but a simple, profound acknowledgement. It acknowledged the storm they had weathered, the pain they had caused, and the separate paths they had forged in the aftermath. It was closure, delivered in a single, silent beat. And then, with a quiet grace that was entirely her own, she turned away. She walked not toward the exit, but deeper into the gallery, toward a collection of restored Renaissance sketches that had captured her eye. She left him standing there, a solitary figure in the light, the next move entirely his to make. Her future was a blank, waiting canvas, and for the first time in her life, she was the one holding the brush. If you were moved by Ilara's journey to find her own strength, please subscribe, like, share, and comment on what this story meant to you.